Hello.
Hi, Mike.
Hello. So, Kevin, did you get my text or my email? Diana is having to reload the video. For some reason, it got removed. So on the grades and standards part.
Oh,
So my question is, can I, after we get through some of the preliminary stuff, can I go back and add that? Hopefully I can add that, a little bit later in the class. Typically I have my PowerPoints all in queue and ready to go. But I don't have the grades and standards one because she's still working on it. It was just fine. I don't know why she messed with it, but anyway.
Great question. I'm kind of on back and forth, and you've been copied on a little bit of it with Richard about getting our other videos uploaded.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we can do that even after the fact too. But,
right. I think, and I did send out the matrices or whatever it was you had forwarded to me earlier.
Oh, perfect. Very good. I appreciate that.
So that went to everybody. I see my good friend Jorge is on with us now. What is this? What is that a thing?
How many do we have joining us right now?
I don't know. I sent the thing out to about 20-something people,
Okay.
and some of which were previous test takers, and certainly some are new. Elizabeth is a new, applicant, I guess. We haven't really even gotten her application in yet. As you can see, her name is here, of course, and the great George Rivera. He took the test down in Miami last time, and so the grades and standards is an important piece of the puzzle for him.
Gotcha. Well, anyway, should I get started?
Well, no, definitely not. This is not enough people.
Okay.
No, Jared, of course.
Yes, Jared.
I think Henry, and I don't know how many people Henry had last week. Henry usually joins us, but
there was quite a bit last week.
How many, Jared?
Quite a bit, maybe like 10 to 15.
Okay.
Hey,
so
Jared,
I think
how you
that's.
Hey, hi.
I think that's realistic, Mike. Is somewhere in that number.
Yeah, it was the Latin doctor from Miami.
Henry.
Yeah, and I was wondering if about his notes. Are those slides going to be sent out?
I don't know if the slides are going to be sent out, but we are going to repost the videos. We're actually working on that right now.
Okay.
To create a YouTube channel for us to put all of the videos up. The one I did, the one Chris did,
okay.
Obviously the one Henry did, and Mike's will be up there as well. So we're going to get that all squared away, hopefully this weekend, and we'll have it up there for next week for everybody to kind of, go back to refer to. Additionally, I don't know if it's necessary to get into it right now with not quite as many people on, but our initial location for the exam was going to be the Hurricane House at the UF Davie campus, and that is not going to happen, as Mike has advised me. Hi, Susan. So we're going to have to punt and move that to a different location. So we found another a client of mine's got actually a really great meeting space that we can fit about 25 people in. We have to be it's an office building, so we have to be conscious of social distancing and making sure that we're very aware of that. But we would do that anyways, whether it was in the Hurricane House or not. So I will hopefully get that information with maps and directions and everything, because we're talking about, that's literally next Friday is the 10th. So we want to make sure we get that information out to everybody as soon as we can. with the address and directions and all that's involved. So
The exam's Friday or Saturday?
Friday morning,
Oh, okay.
Friday the 10th.
Okay.
It's my ex-wife's birthday.
Okay.
Well,
Now I actually have gone by and seen the campus that Mike works at. Is that where we're going to go look at the plant specimens?
yes,
Well,
that's totally fine. That's okay.
so you could do that there, yes. I don't know that I know I had offered that up, but that was sort of like,
It's not open on Sundays. Just know that it's open Monday through Saturday. I would say 8 o'clock until practically, well, dark.
hey, Mike, is everything still like labeled pretty much? Like I know you had signage on a lot of the material.
Well, at Extension, yes. Yes and no. There's some things that we've lost in terms of some of the plant material. But, you know, any of the woodies would still be here for sure. I can double check and make sure that all the signage is out there. I've been trying to prune things and clean it up a little bit. I was gone, you know, working away at home for almost.
Abro la cámara porque no me está funcionando.
But anyway, yeah, most of the signage should be out there. I'll have to take a look at the current plant list too to see what
¿Ah?
we don't have.
O sea, me dice que la cámara no
I
está
couldn't find
funcionando.
a I got the list, but I don't have it.
O
with me.
sea,
I couldn't
yo
remember.
lo veo,
I don't
pero
think I
yo
could
no me
find
puedo ver.
was it a Jamaican strongbark I couldn't find?
Out in the world, yeah, you're never going to find one. There's literally one. It's at UF. It's at the UF campus.
Bahama Strongback is
Strongbark, yeah.
it's by the Hurricane House.
Okay, I mean there was one or two more I could not find.
What else? It's at near the
Okay,
Hurricane
ahora
House.
sí.
We're getting some feedback.
It's George seems to have unmuted himself, and now I think. Oh, there you are.
I've just run into some technical problems.
No, hardly at all. You sound great. How you doing, buddy?
Just doing fine. How are you?
Excellent, excellent.
How you doing, Mike?
Good. How are you?
Just hanging in there, trying to survive.
Isn't that the truth? Good Lord.
Are you
George,
back at your campus office, Mike?
I'm sorry. Yes, I've been here for about 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
And I'm here tonight. I have a much better internet connection here. I don't have to rely on Wi-Fi. I'm hardwired in. So I got tired of doing the tree trimmer classes and losing my audience 4 and 5 times during a single class.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is Susan, Mike. I just
Susan.
wanted
How are
to
you?
clarify I wanted to clarify the process for the testing next week. Here in Hillsborough County, we still are work at home, and I do have to get permission through the county as well as my district director to travel down there next week, which is a little bit cumbersome at this point because for work related, we're not at this point per the county allowed to leave the county. But my director said he would support me on this, and I'm 100% UF paid, so hopefully it's a UF decision. But anyway, I just wanted to clarify the process on the testing. So we're going to meet somewhere and have like a paper or whatever type of a practicum, and then we also do a field test.
Correct.
Kevin, you want to handle that?
Sure. Normally, how it would have gone, Susan, had we been at the Davie campus, we would have physically toured the campus, walked around, and said, as far as the tree ID, gone, hey, what's that or what's this? We're not going to have the ability to do that now. Or if we did, where we're going, I don't think has the same tree palette. In fact, I know for a fact it doesn't have that. And it'd throw everybody off. So what we'll end up doing is I will very likely take the PowerPoint that I did my review on and jumble it up with no words on it and say, what's this? So that's probably how that part will go now. That being said, after we do that, the expectation is that Mike will take people in groups of no more than 10 to the nursery to do the field grading.
Well, I think what we'll probably do is we'll have, if it depends. Rob said that he would allow up to 10 people in his nursery. Everybody had to be in masks and social distancing, but you know, typically what we've done is we've had 3 trees that people have had to grade, and I think we've had up to 2 people per tree, so that would be like 6. And so we'd have 6 people, I guess, come in from, let's say, 8 to 9:30 or 8 to 9. It doesn't take that long to grade 3 trees.
Sure.
And we'd have another 6 come. Yeah, it's gonna have to be 6 because I don't really want more than 2 people on a single tree at the same time. And then, you know, so we're gonna have to have time slots depending on how many people are actually gonna do the grading part of the exam.
And to that end, you know, not everybody, Susan, it needs to do the ID part. Some folks have taken the exam previously and are really just worried about one domain. I know who's on here.
I passed
also-
2 domains before.
Say again?
I passed 2 domains before.
Right on. So Jared has a couple he's got to take. I think George has really just got grades and standards. And then the other folks on here, I think are new applicants and would need to be just taking the whole exam. So Mike, we may only have about 8 to 10 total new applicants, but we wanted to get the opportunity available to all the previous test takers who just needed to retake a domain.
Right, okay.
As well.
Well,
So
just,
we
if
may
you can
be,
get me a list, Kevin, and then we can kind of divvy it up, and maybe the people that are some distance away, we can put them a little later in the morning.
sure,
But
that would be great.
I
Yeah,
think-
George is coming up from Miami. I'm pretty sure he does not want to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Well, I don't.
I don't mind, but I mean, if you can give me an extra time, so that'd be fine.
Right on.
So Kevin, when you get an opportunity to identify where the location is, if you'd let me know, I'd appreciate it because I'm going to need to come in the night before
You are.
and have a hotel that night.
So
And I'd like to be close.
you will be. In fact, I'll give you the address right now. It's 900 South Pine Island Road.
So
And
probably stay in Davie or Plantation, I would think.
Well, there's a slew of hotels right off Pine Island there, Mike, right up the street from where this location is.
Oh, perfect.
It's 900 Pine Island Road, which for you, Mike, it's basically it's Peters and Pine Island.
That's Plantation, yeah.
So
Thank
it's
you.
right up the street, and from where we would have done this, and like I said, there's like a Hilton Four Points or something literally there, and several things in and around the area there. So you should have no trouble. There's an extended stay that's downright affordable right by the mall, as a matter of fact.
All right, thank you.
So check it out. But I'll get out. I want to get maps and addresses and sort of the protocol. Again, it's we're being sort of gifted this space by the property management team, and we just need to make sure that we abide by the building's rules and that we're being considerate of that, and that we, mop it down when we're done and whatnot, slather it with alcohol or whatever, and ensure that we're doing the right thing with distancing. So, and we've got a few different levels of test takers, right? As Jared mentioned, he's got a couple domains to take. Jorge's got one to take, but you would be taking all of it. Alberto would be taking all of it. Casey, Jessica, Andrew, Diana, they're all retakers. Nicholas also retaking. They're new takers. I apologize. So taking the whole exam. It's pretty straightforward stuff, though. Again, I think we've talked about this, and but we were sort of able to secure this space, and there's good AV there, so I think we'll be okay. Should be very nice. But that being said, I think we are at probably 7:15-ish almost. I've preambled quite a bit. So Mike, if you want to
Sure.
pick it up from here.
Okay, let's
You heard
do
back
it.
from Diana?
No, I have not, but that's okay. I'm going to start with a different PowerPoint.
Okay.
So I'm going to share my screen.
Actually, I just got a question for Kevin and you.
You just got to, yeah, sure.
I just gonna take the test on the field, or, whoops.
No, you're okay, George. George, it'd be the field and the multiple choice.
Okay.
But I'll have that section just prepared for you. So you're just doing that section of the multiple choice, and it may be a matter of you may not need to show up until we're ready to do that. So if we're going to kick off the day with plant ID at 7:30 or 8 and do that until 9, you may not even really need to be there until 9, and then you could do either the written part in class and then go do the field review, or
Okay.
vice versa. Depends on. Me and Mike and I and Henry will sit down and with all of our applicants, kind of lay out how the structure will be, and we'll get that information to you and to everybody, so it's not a surprise and you kind of know what your time slot's going to be.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
I think that's the coolest thing to do. That way you're not kind of sitting around waiting for something to happen. All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to make myself disappear slightly, but Mike, please feel free to begin. Oh, you are very silent right now, Mike. You have muted
Okay,
yourself.
now I should be unmuted. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah. Little screen. Little tiny screen.
I can
How's
see it.
that?
That's good.
Okay. How many do we have, Kevin?
Right now, I think we've got about 12 people.
Oh, very good.
Slightly fewer than I expected, but that's okay.
Well, save the best for last.
Right on.
All right. Well, no, you're a hard act to follow. So anyway, welcome, folks. We need
All right,
to
everybody. Good luck.
It's already 7:15. Thank you, Kevin. I do have quite a bit of material tonight that I want to get through. There's a lot of questions on the test that have to do with landscape material, plant material grading, grades and standards, installation techniques, and stuff like that. So we have a little glitch with the one PowerPoint. There was a video we made yesterday, I believe it was, and it was loaded, and then somehow part one of it disappeared this afternoon. And so Diana Ramirez, my right-hand person, is helping kind of try to get that thing back. So we'll just kind of see how it goes. But I want to start out with the top 10 reasons why landscape inspections fail. I should introduce myself as Mike Orfanedes. I'm the commercial horticulture agent with UF IFAS Broward County Extension. I've been here a long, long time. I've seen a lot in my day, and nothing ever ceases to amaze me. I took a little stint for about 3 years with the town of Davie as their first urban forester. And because I missed extension and teaching, I eventually came back to it. But that was a good experience because I got to really see a whole different side of the industry in terms of, the development and review process, the landscape plan development, the site plan committees, P&Z, all that good stuff, and, work with landscape architects. Some were local and some were from out of town, and, a lot of issues that came up, and we did a lot of inspections. One of the things that I think is most important as an inspector is you try to be consistent, and communication is always the key. I'd say 85 to 90% of the problems out there are because something did not get communicated or understood, whether it was the lack of a pre-con meeting, or people were asleep or disinterested, or somebody forgot to email somebody something, or there's an error on the plan. These kinds of things come up. And sometimes it's the fault of on the developer side or the architect. Sometimes it's on the plan reviewer and the inspector. So that's my big message is, communication is key, and that's probably no surprise to any of you. So I put this together after I left the town of Davie and came back to Extension, just because I wanted to kind of use it to teach about my experience with doing landscape inspections. And so, when you go out, you get a permit ticket. That means the site should be ready for inspection, and things should be completed as per plan. And you're going to be inspecting against that plan, and you're going to either pass it or you're going to develop a punch list, which all of that has to be put into the system, meaning generally an electronic record-keeping system that generates potentially a re-inspection ticket. It's a lot of work to go out to these job sites and do re-inspections, and so I do encourage people to put a fee with that, a significant fee, because it's very irritating to go out only to find a contractor say, yeah, well, gosh, I didn't get the mulch in yet, and the viburnums are back ordered. No, they're not ready to inspect until everything is in place. If there's a change order, you can't find something, and this comes up all the time. Again, communication, go back to the inspector, say, hey, look, I can't get the paradise trees because none of them are any good. So I'm going to replace them with crepe myrtles, whatever it is, communication is key. So when I think about the most common reasons that I failed an inspection, probably the first one was poor planting technique. Getting these trees and shrubs off to a good start means using good plant material, but also installing it properly. If at any point you guys cannot hear me, please let me know, because sometimes we've had a lot of thunderstorms late this afternoon and the lights were flickering and, looks like it's cleared up for, for a while. But when you're looking at the placement of a tree, let's say, the zone of rapid taper where the trunk flares out into roots, first order roots, anchor roots, which is what Joe Jimenez's finger is pointing at on the right, that's supposed to be at grade, certainly no more than 2 inches below grade. And I always required, and this was in my punch list and in my pre-con, my conference with these folks, I want to come out and be able to inspect your trees and know they're not too deep because I want to be able to see some trunk flare, we call that. And so Joe is pointing, Joe's the guy who took my place in Davie. I trained him and then I came back to extension. You can see there's a soil stain on that trunk that's at least 4, maybe 5 inches. Whoop. And all of this has been buried under all this soil and mulch. That first order anchor root should be up here. So that tree is a good 6 inches too deep. Here's another one over here, and planting on slopes can be problematic, but basically there again, I want to see the first order root probably on the up slope side at a minimum. Sometimes we split the difference, but this tree is pathetically sunk and low and needs to be elevated. So it's a good quality tree, but the technique is not good. It needs to be elevated, and that's a very simple thing for the crew to do. If the tree has only been in the ground for a week or 2, maybe 3 weeks max, it's very easy to elevate it. Just take the ties off, raise the tree up and retie it. Not a big deal. Probably the most common punch list item I had. The other one that was real common, of course, is the tree did not meet Florida grades and standards, which we're going to get into in a little bit, but we're going to talk a lot about the structure of the trunk, the quality of the root ball, the size of the root ball and the container, whatever. But here I'm looking at a pink tababuya on the right that has a low limb that's almost the same diameter as the leader. And by definition, you cannot have, this is called a codominant condition. You've got essentially a branch that wants to be competitive with the trunk, the main leader, and you cannot have that condition in the in the lower half of the tree in order for it to be a Florida grade number 1, which is probably the most common grade requirement out there in the industry. Florida grade number 1 or better. You'll hear that over and over and over again. And I should mention to you that there's a hierarchy. There are 4 grades of trees. The topmost are the Florida Fancies. The next, slightly less, a little lower quality is the Florida grade number 1 tree, which if for all general speaking purposes, that's acceptable. The Florida grade number 2 is not. Those are trees that have 1 or more issues that basically prevent them from being characterized as a Florida grade number 1. And those trees either need to be replaced or remediated on the site. And remediating this codominant condition is a very simple thing to do with pruning. We'll talk about that in a little more detail later. And the lowest rank is cull, C-U-L-L, and those trees should not be planted on job sites, maybe mitigation areas, but they have enough issues that it's not commercially viable, practical to remediate them. Root systems also a part of the grades and standards, step number 7. We're going to go through a very methodical approach to grading trees a little bit later tonight, but when you have problematic roots, you're going to have problems up top too. And so as you see here, both with the, I believe this was a Cassia suritensis on the left, it has a very constricted circling root system because it was in a container for too long. these trees don't stand up. You might stake them and they're standing straight. You take the stakes off and they fall over with the first gust of wind. This is an oak on the right-hand side, and you can see the circling roots. They're very, very apparent. Dr. Gilman, who was our UFIFAS professor of arboriculture and kind of my mentor in many ways, and Susan, I know you know him well too. He's actually retired now, but his website continues. It lives on, and in fact, I think they've added to it a wealth of information on all this stuff. Ed always taught us that any root that's circled or dived acts like a hinge and does not anchor a tree. So no wonder these trees go over when they come in with these terrible root systems. Some other situations where, you know, landscape installations are incorrect. Not allowing enough rooting space, mature rooting space. We need to think about the future, not the present, when it comes to where we put these trees. And here are some pretty ridiculous examples, and I'll be very candid with you about where they are. This is on the left is my own town of Davie. Gumbo limbo trees planted along a rec trail. Davie is famous for its recreational trails for bikers and walkers and rollerbladers and equestrians, and these trails are all over town. And you know, it's a great thing to beautify them with canopy trees, but my God, you don't plant a gumbo limbo 18 inches off the asphalt. I about pulled my hair out when I saw that. That did not get approved through our planning and zoning, let me assure you. A little farther down the road in Southwest Ranches, hopefully December, Laurentano is not listening in tonight, but somebody planted slash pines in this very little narrow plantable space along Griffin Road. And this is the south side of Griffin Road. They put a nice sidewalk in and all, but my God, there's a ficus hedge there and there's a sidewalk. And what do we know about pine trees? You know, they get good size. And so again, just, you know, right tree, right place. I cannot emphasize the importance of that enough. Some other things, this was, I believe, this was a development, I can't even remember the name of it now, out on the corner of Orange and Domingo, near there. And nice, large estate home, big lots, but the trees lacked, they really lacked for a good installation technique. And so here we see a live oak that somebody has cut the straps off and it's beginning to list or lean. And so that's poor staking technique. A word about staking. Staking is actually not that great for the tree because it somewhat deprives it of the ability to get girth and taper early on, because the rocking back and forth, this is what the research says, helps build the girth and taper. But we all know the wind blows here in South Florida and sometimes pretty darn hard. So it is standard protocol to use some type of a staking system, and there are many of them out there. The black strap was used most widely for many years, but we all know it does not ever biodegrade. Hence, a lot of the bow tie problems and the strangulation, and some of the cities like Plantation have outlawed it. They require sisal rope now, and probably that's a good thing. Sunrise has its own version of, they basically tie a piece of burlap like a donut around the trunk right above the first set of branches. And that's this important thing to point out. You guys should know for the test that when you apply some kind of a tie to the tree, you want to tie it loosely, not tight. And I generally like to see at least 3 ties, 3 stakes, and you loop that around that first cluster of branches. If you tie the tree below the first cluster of branches, the wind's going to rock it back and forth, and eventually the ties are going to fall down. So if they're right above the first set of branches, they're not going anywhere. But you wouldn't believe how many installers will tie them tight the day they install the tree. And so, you know, within a few short months, especially the like the yellow tabs and whatnot, they get these constrictions in them, which are really a problem. So again, put the stakes on, the ties on above, loosely tied in loops above the first set of branches. When it's time to remove the stakes, once the tree is established, okay, and we'll talk about It generally takes about 3 to 4 months per inch of caliper for a tree to become established. This is per Dr. Gilman. So if we think about a standard 3-inch caliper live oak, 3 months is per inch of caliper, that's 9 months to establish, 3 to 4 months, so it's 9 to 12 months, almost a year. So we're gonna leave that tree staked about that amount of time, and then we need to get those stakes and braces off. A lot of times with the wooden stakes, I see the guys pull the wood off, but the metal bands fall to the ground. The mulch truck comes and mulches over that, and nobody ever finds it until the bands get embedded into the trunk. Trees lacking vigor, well, that's often a situation that occurs because of lack of water, pure and simple. And as you can see here on the right, the foliage is pretty much limited to right off the leader where the water supply is still, there's a little bit of moisture in that trunk, but that tree is dying back. And, you know, I used to get in some debates with some of these contractors on the trees that would brown out. And, you know, you got to pick your battles with these guys, but technically if the tree defoliates, and I had one guy that was famous for bringing in a pressure sprayer, and he would blast the tree, and if the leaves would come off, he would try to argue that the tree still had life in it and it would relieve. Well, you need to make your inspection decision on the day of, not 3 to 4 weeks out. And so, you know, sometimes the tree will shock, but if the buds are apparent and it's limber, and when you bend the little limbs, especially out at the terminals, then they're very flexible and they have life in them, you might be able to pass the tree. But if they're brittle and they crack, forget it. So moisture is key and critical. You need to test the irrigation system too. Trunk defects, well, these are grades and standards issues, which we'll cover a little bit later, but sometimes these occur in transit or during installation, not necessarily at the nursery. Missing and dead plant material. So you have a landscape plan that has a legend, it has a number of plants by species. I would probably be a liar to tell you, you know, if I counted up 172 Fakahatchee clumps on that property. But, you know, you've got 9 or 10 inspection tickets to get through that day. It's hot. You've got other things. You might have a report you've got to write up for your P&Z boss. You're not going to have time to count each and every grass out there, clump of grass. But if you look, it looks to me like some stuff is missing here. It's kind of random, kind of hit and miss. There look to be like some voids, and so that might be a clue that somebody either skimped on the count, or perhaps some things died or were removed. So, you know, as you do this, it becomes a lot more second nature. And here too, somebody put some sod down, but apparently maybe they watered the tree but not the sod, or the irrigation wasn't functioning, or somebody cut the line to the system. All kinds of things can happen. But you can't accept that. You're going to put your John Hancock on that inspection ticket, and that's going to say that that plan meets what was approved. And clearly, I would not accept something like that. Poor grading and mulching. Mulch should be about 2 to 3 inches thick. It should never come in contact with the trunk of a tree or a shrub, but it needs to cover all of the open space, the bare ground, which is going to become weeds in a few short weeks. And so this was one of our inspection sites, and they did a lousy job on the mulch. Now, maybe the pool guy came and put the pump in, and or the irrigation guy came and worked on it and messed it up, but you know, that's not my problem. This job is not ready to be inspected. The mulch is missing, and you know, so I would be remiss to pass it. On the other side here on the right, remember I said 2 to 3 inches of mulch should never come in contact with the trunk. I have no idea what these people were thinking. This was a golf course implantation. I went out there for another purpose and talked to them about some things, and on my way out, I said, good God, I've never seen so much mulch in my life. So a little goes a long way. The last one is the site degradation. It's so important if you're working on a site where trees are to be preserved that you have some agreements ahead of time about where the tree protection barriers are going to be needed. because if you don't specify that, if you don't require that, if you don't require that the tree barriers and protection apparatus be installed prior to the arrival of all the big heavy equipment, you're going to have some damage. And, you know, putting the porta potties next to a tree that's supposed to be preserved, dumping rebar and concrete poles and all that kind of stuff, it just makes no sense. Changing the grade on these trees. So you need to insist on good tree protection barriers. Usually they're wooden posts or rebar driven into the ground with probably 4-foot high construction fencing. And they need to be periodically evaluated because they often come down. And these guys that work these big pieces of equipment, it's hot out there, I get it. They love to park that stuff under the big trees because of the shade, but that damages the roots. It reduces, it compacts the soil, reduces the available pore space, and can cause a lot of damage. So I'm going to leave that PowerPoint at the moment and try to get into another one. Let's see here. So that's the top 10 reasons why landscape inspections fail. Now let me see if we can get into some dynamics with landscape installations. Can you guys see this? Landscape installation?
Nope.
No?
Mike, we only really see
I
you
can't see
right
it.
now.
Okay, I've got to somehow share this. Let's see. I think I actually have to back out of it. Back out of it. Now I need to share my screen again. And let's see here. Reasons why landscape inspections fail. Basic PowerPoints. I'm going to have to try to retrieve this. Okay, videos. Standards. All right, I think I'm going to go into the grades and standards. Talk first. Okay, can you guys see that?
I can't.
I
Not?
can't.
No?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Let me back out of that. And let me back out of this. And let me go back into here. Share the screen. And okay, can you see that?
Yeah, I see the,
The Florida grades and standards?
nope.
No, we see your file explorer.
You have to choose the PowerPoint.
New share? Okay. Now can you see that?
Yes, sir. No. Yes.
Yes,
Yes
it
or
is.
no? It says,
Yes.
should say the Florida grades and standards? Okay.
Yep.
It's clear as a bell.
We're still kind of learning this procedure. So I want to start out by saying a few things about the Florida grades and standards. First of all, so, you know, we've talked about some issues related to the site and the installation technique. Now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the actual quality parameters that affect what we're going to be evaluating. And so the Florida Grades and Standards is a document that is put together by the FDACS, Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services. They actually have a little committee of folks that are in the nursery business, the landscape business, and some of the regulatory and academic type people. And the most recent revision was in 2015. We used to have, prior to that, a 10-step process that was a little bit cumbersome. And so they kind of condensed some of the steps into 7 steps. And for the most part, I was pretty happy with it. There's a few things I think need to be tweaked. But the good news, I guess, is that they've been meeting again this year and coming up with apparently a 2020 version, which we have yet to see. But the document can be accessed by going to the FDEX website and just Googling Florida Grades and Standards. I know the Marshall Tree Company, www.marshalltrees.com, and I believe Cherry Lake Nursery also. You can pull it off of their website for free. But it's kind of interesting. It has quite a history. The Grades and Standards was actually introduced into the Florida legislature back in 1955. The first edition came out in 1959. I was 1 year old. 1963 was the second edition, 1973 the third edition, 1998 was the fourth edition, and that was the one I learned and cut my teeth on. Because from 1998, it was 17 years before they came out with this 2015 version, which is what we have today. And I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a little Q grading card with the 7 steps. It's laminated, and I'll show you, I have a PowerPoint slide of it coming up, but that is a really handy little put in the back pocket kind of step-by-step grading procedure summary that's very useful to you, I would think. Another thing I should say about the Grades and Standards was the reason why it developed, and there's only a handful of states that have it. Illinois is one of them, that's my home state. I think California has something similar. It was to provide some base for negotiating quality parameters and price between growers, installers, and end users about the quality of nursery stock, because it was the wild, wild west out there, and you could argue it in some ways still is. But this document has a lot of history. I really don't think it was widely embraced until the 90s. And I know that here in Broward County, where the Landscape Inspectors Association got started about 1990, before my time, they really hooked onto this and promoted the heck out of it and tried to get a lot of people trained in it, which I think the 90s coincided with really the big development boom in Broward County. Miami was kind of filling up with people, and folks were wanting to have more space. And so Broward County kind of became suburban Miami almost. In Fort Lauderdale, and of course that has continued, through the years. Then Palm Beach has urbanized quite a bit, and it's going on up the coast all the way to St. Lucie. So I don't know whether that's progress or not, but when it comes to trying to put back some of what's been removed, good landscape plans, good quality plant material, and good maintenance practices are key to making that happen. Now, I don't want to take credit for putting this PowerPoint together. It's actually Bill Burns, William Burns, he goes by William now these days, who's the president of our Landscape Inspectors Association. Great guy, friend of mine, colleague for many, many years. And Bill put this together really at the get-go when it first came out. So it's a combination of some diagrams, some schematics, and a lot of photos, but I'm going to kind of try to take you through the grading process. That's the goal here. So just know that Grades and Standards originated because of, again, to simplify communication and have some basic agreed upon benchmarks for what dictates quality. And we know from a lot of arboriculture science and record keeping and observations over the years with the many storms Florida has seen that trees will fail for a number of reasons. One of the most common, of course, is multiple trunks, so we call them predominant leaders. And where those trunks come together, there's often what's called a pinch point or an inclusion, a bark inclusion. You literally have bark pinched inside the crotch. And we can even see this condition sometimes in young trees and plant material coming out of nurseries, although it's not real common at that stage. It seems to develop further, over time. But you can see an inclusion here on the right. It will look like a valley, and those are pinch points where there's no real attachment between those two trunks. They're just growing up against each other, and as they increase in girth over time, they can actually begin to self-wound. And so when the wind blows, or sometimes not even when the wind blows, they eventually, gravity never takes a break, they will come down and go boom. And here you see the bark inclusions close up. Over here is a perfect example, classic textbook example of an inclusion a point where bark became pinched between two competing codominant stems or leaders, both of which are approximately the same size. We get concerned about that condition primarily with medium and large maturing trees, not so much, ligustrum and crepe myrtles and stuff like that. So the steps now to go through, there's 7 of them, if you can bear with me. The first is we need to identify the species, and that's real important, and that's why we have Plant ID as a foundation of this whole course and this certification. You obviously need to know what you're talking about, and we feel the Latin names are important because sometimes people, and we're a very international bunch here in Florida, we may know this tree as poinciana, we may know it as flamboyant, but we all agree it's Dolonex regia. Similar, water oak, swamp oak, laurel oak, live oak, people get confused, but we have a scientific name that helps us zero in on exactly what species that is. And interestingly, recently in my homeowners association, we replaced some street trees. They were supposed to be seedling live oak. And for whatever reason, the installer snuck a laurel oak or 2 in, and one of the board members, I actually saw it early on, but didn't say anything. But one of the board, I think an oak tree is, what's a little diversity? Anyway, one of the board members got kind of upset about the fact that he said, "Why does this tree look this way?" He says, "Is this a live oak?" And I said, "Well, Pete, it's an oak. I don't think it's a live oak. I think it has some laurel blood in it." And I knew where he was going with this. And so he eventually, it was in his community, he wanted it out. And so, somebody screwed up and mistook it for a live oak when in fact it wasn't. And so it's important to be on the same page and know what species you're dealing with. So once you know the species, then you're going to identify it with a matrix. And there are 3 matrices. Kevin emailed all of you a handout that you probably don't have with you at this point. You probably didn't get it in time to have a printout, but there are matrices, which are tables within the grades and standards that specify certain parameters, and I'm going to go through them with you. There's 3 matrix tables. There used to be 5. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but it's a table, okay? And the first one, type 1, are the tall and wide form trees. So this is going to be your poinciana, your magnolia, your black olive, your live oak, the trees that get big and spread. And along the left-hand most column is the caliper. The calipers range anywhere from 1.5 to 10 inches in trunk caliper. And we measure caliper up to 4 inches and below. That's measured at 6 inches above grade. If the tree has a caliper, and that's most of your trees that are going to come in on these job sites are going to be 4 inches or less. You measure that at 6 inches above grade, or the flare, the root. If they're larger trees than that, and they're coming in 60 and 95 and up size containers, then you're going to measure that at 12 inches. Okay, it's just what it is. You kind of have to accept it. But once you know the caliper, then it's just a matter of reading over across the top of the table, finding your caliper, reading across to find out what the height requirement is. It's a minimum. What the crown diameter minimum is for the given caliper, and then either the diameter of the root ball or the container size. All of those are specific to certain trunk caliper measurements. So, and again, this is for the type 1. So for a 3-inch live oak, you need to have the tree be at least 8 feet tall and have a minimum of a 54-inch spread. And that is a good test question. The spread should be the widest point in the canopy from side to side by the widest depth, the front all the way to the back. And you basically average that. So 54 inches, what is that? 4.5 feet. So you're going to eyeball this. But if the tree came in at less than 54 inches, let's say it was 48 or 43, it would not meet the required crown diameter, and that would be a downgradable situation. Similarly, with regard to the root ball, if it's a ball and burlapped tree, 3-inch caliper, you need at least a 32-inch wide root ball or a 45-gallon container. So here again, it's important to be able to recognize your container size, especially if your inspections are going to be off the truck. Some cities require an inspection at delivery and after installation. The city of Plantation actually has a year out re-inspection, which I think is a great idea because a lot of things happen that first year. You'd be surprised. Stuff gets stolen. The restaurant manager owner may say, that tree is going to block my signage, and on the weekend he takes it out. City of Weston does annual inspections every year on all their commercial properties, and they reference what was approved with what's there, and they make them mitigate the difference. So anyway, the matrix is huge. It's super important. And as I said, you all have a copy of it in your email. Maybe you were able to print it out. I don't know, but I've got some pictures coming up where we're going to be talking about that. And the second matrix has to do with the more tall columnar species. And the third matrix is for more of the shorter, broader spreading kinds of trees like tababuyas and whatnot. So you got to identify your matrix, and here Bill has put together a little schematic showing you what these different classifications are. Multi-trunk go into their own category. The rest of these are pretty much single trunk, okay? We'll look at a few examples. Tall and wide, I already mentioned live oak and poinciana. The red maple would fall in that matrix 1 classification as well. Matrix 2 are going to be the more tall and narrow, and there's some subjectivity here. I believe the Hoon Holly is in here, a few others that get, some of the, maybe, I don't know about cypress trees, but, well, let me look here and I'll give you some examples right out of the grades and standards itself. Okay, they've got Eagleston holly, East Palatka holly, Italian cypress. Now that's a no-brainer. Japanese blueberry, a real common replacement tree right now for people that take their oaks down, putting Japanese blueberries in. Little gem magnolia, pine is included in tall and narrow, and southern red cedar. Those are some examples. In the grades and standards, there's a much longer, more drawn out kind of list, and it's by species that you can check because the matrix will just give you a few examples across the top. And not every potential tree, the species in that category. And then the matrix 3, the short and wide, and the multi-trunked include things like bottlebrush, crepe myrtle, ligustrum, pigeon plum, sea grape, silver buttonwood, your tababuyas, wax myrtle, and yopon holly. So again, the required heights, crown diameters, and root ball size or container size are going to vary from one matrix to another. And that's why they've kind of done these general classifications by the average growth and mature size and conformation of the species. So here's your crepe myrtle for matrix 3. So let's talk about poinciana. Which matrix would that be in?
Short and wide, number 1.
Tall and wide.
Tall, sorry, tall and wide.
This one may be a little bit short, but poincianas typically do get pretty big. That's a gorgeous one. How about this one? What matrix would this be? Italian cypress.
Number 2.
Mm-hmm.
2.
Correct. And the golden tababuya, or I guess this may be the yellow tab, one or the other, chrysostraka or cariba. All the tababuyas fall into this matrix, which is which one?
2.
3. Matrix 3.
Okay.
Actually. They do not get super tall typically. Okay.
I have seen some of the real tall ones.
Oh, I know. I get it. I agree with you. These matrices are not perfect. In fact, I really liked it when they had 5 matrices, but the committee was charged with simplifying the document because people felt it was too difficult to use. So maybe in the next revision, they will go back to that. I really don't know.
It would be funny because you got the Bahamensis
Mhm.
and how you would rate the Bahamensis. It's kind of,
Good question.
it falls in between.
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's a little bit contrived. I get that. But it is what it is. It's, you know, we kind of have to go by the books, even if we may have individuals that don't follow that. So anyway, that's step one. And we have for you guys a sheet that I will email you. It's called a tree grading form, okay? And this is what you're going to get when you do your test. And all of these steps are, you'll have this when you'll get one for each of the 3 trees that you're going to be responsible to grade. We're going to go through a couple of examples here. And it's just like a tally sheet or a tick sheet, and you just kind of keep track of it as you move through the steps. So step 1, choose the matrix after you have identified the species, and then measure the caliper. B, what is the caliper? And we measure it where? 6 inches above grade. For
Great.
trees up to and including 4 inches. Okay. If you put the caliper measurement, and gosh, I'll show you. I have a picture of one coming up. You can get them. I pick up usually several of them when I go to some of the tree meetings. But Marshall has one. Marshall Tree Farm. You can use a diameter tape. Cherry Lake puts them out on their tables too. And you just put it against the trunk, and you measure. You just read it. I want to mention to you that it's in 1/2 inch increments. The matrix, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4. So what do you do if you get a 2 1/4 inch measurement on your caliper? You round down, always round down. That's what the grades and standards says. So if it comes in at 2 1/4, you're going to call it a 2 inch caliper tree. If it comes in at 3 1/4, you're going to call it a 3 inch tree. If it comes in at 3.75, it's going to be a 3.5 inch caliper. Okay. So now for multi-trunked small maturing trees such as crepe myrtle and wax privet, for example, you measure the container size or the root ball diameter and ignore the caliper, because how are you going to measure the caliper when you got multiple trunks? So that's step 1. Step 2, we're going to grade the trunk. And, you know, if we could do this face to face, this would be so cool. That's why I have the video tonight. Grading the trunk, we're looking pretty much for a well-defined, very upright growing, straight, more or less straight trunk from the base of the tree to the very top, okay? And when it comes to codominancy, multiple trunks, we're looking to be critical about that. And basically, a fancy, the very highest grade, cannot have any fork or bifurcation in the trunk in the lower 90% of the tree. So that means if it forks up top, it's okay as long as it's in the upper 10%. Now, if it forks at the midpoint, so let's say it's a 10-foot tree and it's forking at 5 feet, that will barely make a number 1. If it forks at 4 feet and it's a 10-foot tall tree, it's now the fork or the bifurcation, the codominant connection, if you will, is below the midpoint, which is 5 feet, and therefore it becomes a number 2. Okay? And so we'll go through a few examples of that. In all situations with number 1s and fancies, the leader has to be the tallest. So let's say you have a tree, it's a codominant, it's a number 1, the codominancy occurs at 7 feet, 10-foot tree, but there's a fairly well-defined leader, but the codominant is actually taller than the leader itself. That's going to be a problem. You cannot have that. Now, when you're grading trees, we're looking at them as they are the day we're grading them. We're not thinking about remediation. That's a punch list item. And so if you feel that tree is worthy of being accepted with remediation, then you would require on the punch list that the codominant be shortened sufficiently such that it no longer has any ability to outcompete the leader.
Okay. No.
Is that clear?
Yes.
So
Very clear.
I'm looking at a grade number 1 tree here. This is Florida grade number 1, the bifurcation, the splitting, if you will, of the tree into 2 equally sized limbs occurs above the midpoint. That could be accepted as a Florida grade number 1 tree with no remediation, except if the codominant is taller than the leader. And so, you know, here it's a little bit up in the air as to which of the 2 the leader is. I think you could make a case for either one. The tree on the left, I'm sorry, on the right, you've got a little clearer picture of the leader in the center being the true leader. And so the one on the right, the codominant, probably still would meet the grade number 1 designation. Okay. Now, a number 2, I said the bifurcation occurs below the midpoint, and that's what we're seeing on the left. Or it can have a terrible dog leg in the clear trunk zone. Now, that's what I'm seeing here. There's a dog leg. The clear trunk zone is the portion of the tree that's below the lowest branch. So from here on down, this is called the clear trunk zone. And this offset is a dog leg, and that's a downgradable defect if and only if it's in the clear trunk zone. All this is on the little cue card, okay? If the dog leg is up in the canopy, we ignore it, okay? And in order to downgrade this, the offset has to be greater than the diameter of the trunk at the point of the offset. So in this case, that is technically a dog leg. This kick in the leader is sufficiently significant that it is greater than the diameter of the trunk. Is that clear? A lot of inspectors fail trees because of dog legs in the canopy, and they really do erroneously. That is not, they shouldn't be doing that. Another reason you might be able to classify a tree as a number 2 is if it has multiple codominants in the upper half. We're not talking about just 2, but it has multiple. In a lot of gumbo limbos, I'll caution you, come in looking like this. Why? Because gumbo limbos in the nursery are typically topped. They don't throw a branching pattern, branching structure very readily. And so the nurseryman will often top them and let the sprouts come, and then they kind of develop all of these different codominant limbs all attached at the same point. Now think about that. You don't have a well-defined leader. All of the canopy is invested in one point on the tree. So should any of those limbs fail at some point in the future, either due to bad pruning, storm damage, mechanical injury, whatever, you get decay in this zone and it compromises the entire canopy. What the nursery should do is select one of these, probably this one, put a training stake back on the tree, tie this up straight, and shorten these other 4 leader wannabes by making reduction cuts, and we'll get into that a little bit later, so that they behave themselves and don't compete with the leader. And as long as they're reduced in vigor, they probably will not form significant inclusions. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Okay, good. The last
Right, are typical to do that too.
The last category is cull, and that's where you have now multiple leaders below the midway point, or you've got a trunk that is just really wayward and has no real chance of ever straightening out. And so, I mean, I love fixing culls. I would work on this. I'd make a topping cut here. I'd let some sprouts come and put a training stake on it, and I'd have me probably a number 1 in about a year or 2. But that's not real practical, certainly not on a job site. You're not going to leave an inspection ticket open for months on end. It just isn't going to happen. People want their CO. They also don't want to pony up the money to get a TCO, a temporary certificate of occupancy. That's a real rare thing. We have done it in some cases, but it's a little bit messy because people want their money back, and then you've got to come back and inspect it again, and it gets a little hairy. So that's step 2. I'm going to move on because I know it's getting late. Step 3, we're going to grade the uniformity of the crown. Okay, so we've identified the matrix, we've recorded the caliper, we've graded the trunk. Now we're going to look at the canopy of the tree. Now, this used to be 2 steps and they combined it into one, and I've never been quite entirely happy with what they did here. I'll tell you why. They only give us 2 choices. There is no designation fancy or number 1, number 2, and cull. It's either a fancy or a number 2, meaning it's either an acceptable or a reject. And the reality is a lot of trees aren't good enough to be fancies, but they're not bad enough to be number 2s. They're really number 1s. I've made that case to the committee. I, quite frankly, have to be honest with you, don't think I got too far with them. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. So what is acceptable? I call this the yay or the nay step. Anything that has some semblance of uniformity, some semblance of balance in the canopy would be acceptable. You know, in my mind's eye, this is a prettier tree than that one, but this void here is not significant enough that we would reject the tree. And I'll tell you, the other thing going on here with this is, in all practical purposes, most of this canopy that you're looking at on the inspection day is temporary. These limbs are at what, 6, 7, 8 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet even. If these are street trees, all of that foliage is eventually coming off because you're going to be elevating your street trees to probably 14 feet. So that's part of the reason why I think they've kind of watered this step down. But let's look at what's unacceptable. It's basically ugly trees. Trees that are really far out of balance, lopsided, one-sided. Sometimes it's related to the fact they were grown too close together in the nursery, or something was shoved up against a wall, or perhaps there was some breakage of limbs during transit and planting. There's a lot of reasons, but these trees would not be acceptable. Again, other than really aesthetics, there's nothing wrong with them. But they would be, it's very difficult to remediate a tree that's got an unbalanced canopy. It has to go back to the nursery and probably be pruned pretty hard and then allowed to regrow. So this is not like you can subordinate or shorten a codominant leader and call it a day. This is going to take some time. So, you know, again, kind of subjective. The whole grading procedure is. So step 4 is very simple. It's basically, what is the lowest grade we've given this tree so far? And so as I'm looking at my tree grading form, let's say we gave it a fancy on trunk structure, but we gave it a number 2 on crown uniformity because it was an ugly, unbalanced canopy. Well, then the answer is the lowest grade determined so far is a number 2. And quite honestly, at that point, you could stop the inspection and pink tag that tree for replacement. Another example might be, though, that let's say the trunk structure, it had codominancy, and in fact, it was in the lower half. It was a gorgeous tree other than the fact it forked before the midpoint. And it has one branch that's really kind of too big. You could put on your punch list, subordinate that codominant leader fairly aggressively, and I will pass that tree and make it become a number 1. Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of remediation and all. We have a little bit of time on that if we don't run too late here. What time is it? It's already 8 minutes after 8, so I want to keep moving on. But anyway, step 4, we record the lowest grade determined in steps 2 or 3. And again, if your eyes are beginning to glaze over and you feel like I'm losing you, the tree grading cue card and the tree grading form, which all of you will have the day of the test and before. We'll send this out. I think we didn't send this out today, but I do have it coming up. I have a picture of it, a slide of it. You just follow through. And so we get into the next step 5. These are the major downgrades, and step 6 are the minor downgrades, and the last step is grade the root ball. You're with me. So let's say we're at a number 1. It had a trunk structure that we thought was a number 1, and the crown uniformity was acceptable. So we want to ask, are there other factors that maybe things in the matrix that this tree is not going to meet, or maybe some injuries or some other things that would degrade its quality? We're going to go through those now. So with the major downgrades, if one of the following statements is true, reduce the grade you gave it in step 4 by 1. So if it was a fancy and one of these A, B, C, D, or E statements is true, it's going to go from a number 1 to a number 2. It could go from a fancy to a 1. It could go from a 2 to a cull. So what are these important downgrades? First of all, A, the tree does not meet the height requirement. Where do we get that? We go to the matrix. So for a matrix 1 tree, let's take our live oak. Let's say it's 3-inch caliper live oak, it needs to be 8 feet. And so if it's 9 feet or 10 feet or even 8 feet, you're going to pass it. It's okay. B, the crown does not meet the diameter requirement. Again, we go back to the matrix, we find our caliper, we read over to the crown diameter column. That 3-inch caliper live oak needs to be 54 inches wide and deep. Okay, so it either makes it or it doesn't. If it makes it, we keep moving on. Root ball is not secure enough to successfully transplant. Okay. This happens sometimes because trees are stepped up into a larger container and sold prematurely. Doesn't happen often, but it can happen. So really the 45 you thought you were buying is really a 25. And somebody may be trying to pull the wool over your eyes. That tree should have stayed in the nursery for a bit longer before it was sold as a 45. More often than not, though, the tree has a root defect. It's got circling roots. It was in a 3-gallon container or a 10 or a 15, too long. And they shifted it up into a larger container, never clipped any of the circling roots. And as a result, it's not secure in the larger container, even though it's been in there a long time. So that's why in the video, I'll rock the tree back and forth and side to side. And if the container and the tree move as one, I know I've got me a pretty secure root ball. If the tree's moving, but the container's not, that's not good. So that's C5D. The root ball or container is undersized. Again, go back to the matrix. 3-inch caliper live oak should be either 32 inches diameter on the root ball for ball and burlap or in a 45-gallon container. And let me tell you, during the downturn, which I guess now was quite a while ago, it seems like it was yesterday, back in 2008, 2009, 2010, nurseries weren't selling much plant material. We saw a lot of trees coming in on the job sites that did move forward. A lot of 3-inch caliper trees in 25-gallon containers. And so the nursery, you know, they were trying to make a buck, and, you know, I don't blame them for doing that, but they didn't have enough people to do the work to shift them up in a proper manner and trim those roots. Ideally, based on Dr. Gilman's research and the work going on with the Roots Plus growers, who, by the way, helped fund the tree cue card, the root ball should be shaved when you step it up into a larger container, or in fact, even when you plant it. I know that doesn't happen often, but some of the better growers have embraced this, or they're using container technology that is such that the roots are self-pruned. There's a number of different ways that we could get into a whole hour discussion on air pots and root pruning, you know, containers and whatnot. But with Dr. Gilman, we did a lot of studies down here in South Florida with, you know, shaving the root balls each time we stepped the tree up into a bigger container. It made a tremendous difference. And so a lot of the good growers have embraced that. So anyway, assuming all that checks out, there's one more step here in the major downgrades. Tree with a trunk caliper larger than 2 inches requires a stake to hold the tree erect. Okay, wow. Well, this is really one that often gets away. I see probably the rule rather than the exception, trees getting installed on job sites and being passed with the training stakes still on them. Now, what this downgrade is getting at is the tree requires the stake to stand up. That's a problem. And you should know that staking trees, again, too long doesn't do them any favor. And I've had a few of these in my yard. I had one tree I thought I was going to have to exercise, like push it every day back and forth to get it to toughen up, because it just flopped back and forth. My God, it hit my neighbor's house a couple of times. eventually it did straighten out, but I tethered it with a rope to another tree. You don't want to tie it to a fence because if the wind blows hard enough, the fence goes down and takes the tree with it. I've learned that too. You know, some of this also comes from prematurely elevating the canopy. Remember, those low temporaries are critically important to getting a good beefy trunk. And too many people like to limb them up too soon. So in this case, we want to know that that tree is not dependent on that stake to keep it, hold it up erect. And so if the trunk caliper is larger than 2 inches and it still needs a stake, then you've got a weak tree. And the only way to know that is to take the darn stake off. And that's where a lot of inspectors really don't do their due diligence. They pass it anyway. The other problem with that, of course, is, let's say it's a commercial plaza, a Walmart. Do you think anybody in that Walmart store is focused on the landscaping enough to be concerned about that? Most likely not. And so those stakes and those training poles, conduit, I've seen even rebar, believe it or not, become embedded in the root ball or even in the trunk. And that becomes a real issue later on. So one exception on this I want to just suggest is with silver buttonwood standards, they really are not, they don't really want to be a single leader, and they're very, very hard to get them to stand up early on. And so that was one species I would sometimes pass with the trunk, with the stake on it. It used to be 1 inch, and when they went through the revision, they increased it to 2 inches. So those are the major downgrades. So if any one of those statements was true, we would downgrade the grade we gave that tree in step 4 to 1 lower than what it was. Now, hang in there with me. I know this is a little hairy, but we're going to move on. Step 6 and step 7 is the last step. Step 6 are the minor downgrades. Now it takes 2 true statements to reduce the grade determined in step 5 by 1 grade. If 3 or more statements are true, you reduce the grade by 2. So if you had 3 issues coming up here and it was a number 1, you'd be at a call with basically down to call. So one thing I want to mention with a fancy, I think it's only 1 minor downgrade because fancies are really up there, and very seldom do we ever get a plan that requires Florida fancy. But anyway, let's look at what some of these minor downgrades are. Remember, we're looking for 2 defects, not 1. Flush cuts were made when pruning branches from the trunk. All right, I hope you guys know what a branch collar is. A collar is the swelling where a branch attaches to the trunk. That should stay on the tree. A properly executed removal cut removes the limb back to the branch collar. It does not make a cut flush on the trunk and exposed trunk wood. It leaves that swelling, that little shoulder, if you will, on the trunk. Don't cut that off. That's important in terms of keeping the pruning wounds small. Flush cuts make bigger, wider pruning cuts, and the collar is there to basically kind of protect the trunk wood from decay and fungi and whatnot. So flush cuts are not good. I know some inspectors have taken off for properly executed removal cuts. They say there's a wound there. Well, so what? It's a properly executed cut. Don't go there. Sometimes the inspectors have to be re-educated, or sometimes they didn't. Some of them don't have certification. The other kind of opposite situation is branch stubs. Instead of cutting the limb too short, they leave it too long. And those are piddly. Those can easily be removed with a little saw or sometimes even a Felco. But branch stubs are also a no-no. Open trunk wounds. Now this is very important, and there is a test question on it. Wounds are considered open when they are greater than 10% of the trunk circumference and or more than 2 inches tall. Okay, now we're not looking at surface abrasions. You know, a lot of these trees are grown in nurseries and they're tied to like a tether line just to kind of hold them up so they don't blow over in windstorm. And they'll sometimes get a scuff on them. We're not talking about that. Sometimes there'll be some little vertical cracks in the trunk because the trunk tissue is expanding at a rapid rate. we're not really talking about that. We're talking about wounds, okay? Wounds that have occurred because of mechanical damage, most likely to the trunk, either in the nursery, during transit, or at installation. Or it can even be vandalism before the inspection. But again, in order to be downgradable, it has to be greater than 10% of the circumference, which is not the diameter, but it's the distance around the trunk, and or more than 2 inches tall. Okay, so that's important too. A few more of these minor downgrades. More than 10% of the crown exhibits necrosis or chlorosis or damage from pests, diseases, or tip dieback. So necrosis means basically necrotic, dead, dried out, tissue, like you'd see in that one slide where the tree didn't get water. It's stressed out. Chlorosis, don't really see that all that often on nursery stock that's coming in, but I suppose it could occur. Damage from pests. Oh, when we had the whitefly epidemic, there was a lot of that, especially on the gumbos. Yeah, you don't want to be approving something that's loaded with insects or has got a bad fungal problem or something like that. The crown is thin and sparsely foliated. That often is sign of a weak tree. For whatever reason, maybe it was overwatered and had some root rot. You're going to know those kinds of trees. They just look spindly and kind of weak. I do want to mention that the time of year does need to be taken into account. So if you're grading cypress trees in January and they don't have much foliage on them, it doesn't necessarily mean they're no good. Even similar with some of the canopy trees like live oak, they may be in that seasonal changeover period if it's February or March. So you guys are smart, you know that. F, there is included bark between the trunk and a major lateral branch or between main trunks. Very seldom have I ever seen this, even though codominancy is rampant, because typically speaking, these trees are kind of young and codominants have not had enough time to basically run into each other. I do actually have in a slide coming up where there's a slight inclusion, but that's why it's considered a minor downgrade. And then last but not least, trunks and or major branches are touching. Rubbing limbs, crossing limbs are potential source of disease because of the wounding, and very common problem on multi-trunked trees, especially ligustrum. One of my pet peeves as an inspector was accepting trees, ligustrums in particular, that had the crossing limbs, because sometimes these would be 2 and 3 inch diameter limbs, and to me, it was just poor growth, poor training. The branches should radiate out, and none of them should be on top of one another. And ligustrums are somewhat susceptible to canker, stem canker, and we see them, whole sections of them die out. So I sometimes was pretty rough on some of the inspections about this issue. And I have to be honest with you, I probably was not on super solid ground with it, because it is not technically a major defect. It's a minor defect. But you as the inspector, you can, shoot the moon, ask for whatever you want, see what you can get. But if I was to be challenged on that, on a grades and standards basis, I really wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. I'm telling you how it was, guys.
Hey, Mike, I have a question.
Sure.
On the ligustrums, you were talking about that stem canker. I've noticed a lot of ligustrums, like over the last, 9 months to 12 months, just starting to kind of crap out.
Oh, yeah.
a quarter, a half, 3/4 of the whole canopy, and then ultimately dying. Is that what's going on with those?
I live out in Weston, and it's an epidemic. We're losing them right and left, and they're old. They're 25, 30 years old. Are the ones you're talking about in that same age category?
I would say probably 10, 12 years old, 10 to 15 years old.
That seems a little premature, but yeah, well, they get Cercospora leaf spot this time of year and they defoliate. So that's a stress. They get that leaf spot. That doesn't usually kill them, but it weakens them. But then there are these stem cankers that they form. And literally, if you look closely, and they're usually not out in the outer part of the canopy, but more closer toward the base.
Okay.
And you'll just see like, like a canker. It's just like it's been girdled. And once that tissue dies completely 360 degrees around that stem, the whole thing is
Right.
going to go. And that's what we're seeing, Casey, exactly. A third of the bush is gone, or half of it's died back. Or we've been slowly chipping away at these, and they're at a point now where they look so bad they just need to come out. But I think it's related to fungus. I really do.
Okay. All right. I'll
Irrigating
definitely
at
look for
night-
that. I've checked them out before and I didn't really notice anything, to the eye, but I'll take a closer look and see if I see any, any like.
Yeah, that would be good. And, I think if they're irrigated at night, anything that causes fungi, like long periods of wetness, is not good either.
Sure. And that goes along with anything, right? Ganoderma, all that stuff.
Yeah, people
Yeah.
running irrigation at 10 p.m. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. Run it at 6
Sure.
in the morning. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's it on the step 6. The last step, guys, we're coming into the home stretch here. We're going to grade the root ball. And they added in the new revision, step A. We didn't have A before, and it's a good thing because it addresses deep planting. And basically it says, and this is huge. Think about this. If this tree is a Florida fancy and we're at step 7, we're like super excited, and all of a sudden we grade the tree out as a cull if one of these two statements is true. I mean, it goes from fancy to cull in one fell swoop because of one of these root defects. The topmost structural root, these are the large anchor roots emerging from the trunk or the root collar, are more than 2 inches below the top of the soil surface. So in other words, these trees have been stepped up, and every time they step them up, they plunge them. They plunge them. They keep burying the root plate deeper and deeper. And I've seen it. I've seen it a lot. Nursery people need to train their folks to plant shave those roots and plant those trees at the proper depth each and every time they shift them up into a bigger container. So now the good news is you can remove soil and actually roots, even adventitious roots, which is a lot of what will form up in that top buried layer, from the top 1/3, and this whole thing goes away. And I've pulled adventitious, I'm talking about the little fibrous roots, and there's tons of them, and they're kind of going every which way. Remove all that crap and get it down to the real flair, the first order root. Part B is perhaps more important in some ways. This is a carryover from the original grades and standards. And this is a mouthful, but one or more roots greater than 1/10 the diameter of the trunk circle more than 1/3 of the way around in the top half of the root ball. So this defect is going to be confined to the top half. And I asked Dr. Gilman, why is it the top half? He says, because that's most of what your permanent root system is going to be. A lot of those roots below that aren't going to have enough oxygen to develop. And what's going to develop is in the upper section of the root profile. Okay, but they have to be more than 1/3 of the way around and greater than 1/10 the diameter of the trunk at that point, the caliper. So if it's a 3-inch live oak, that root would need to be 1/10 of 3 inches, whatever that amount is. And you can eyeball this. Now the good news here too is if you cut that root that circles at the point where it originates, the cull designation goes away. And so inspectors, can't get crazy about this. I always maintained if the tree was planted at the proper depth, in other words, the flare, the first order root was right at grade, I didn't have to get my fingers dirty. And I don't have time to be digging. I'm not going to go around digging looking for trouble. But if these trees are planted correctly, 9 times out of 10, you're going to see these kinds of defects without having to do a lot of work. I know some inspectors who were like hunting dogs and would literally scour away and pick away and chip away at the root ball and leave it that way, exposed. And boy, it's nothing to make a contractor mad at you more than something like that. And some of the nursery owners, they don't like it either. So bottom line is with good communication, get the planting depth correct, and then you should not really have too much difficulty finding these defects. But if you do, put it on the punch list, they can be cut out, and then the tree could be passed. So that's the grades and standards in a nutshell. Now, I am going to try to pull up the video. Diana, you may need to help me, but we have a video here where we kind of went through this and with Occlusia, and I want to see if we can share that with you right now. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go in and see if I can pull this video up.
Mhm.
I'm going to go to the video file. That one's empty. Okay. That's the tree pruning. We don't want to be in there.
The folder is called only videos, Mike, and the same folder.
All right, let me go back up here. Bear with me, guys. So we had this embedded in the PowerPoint, and then somehow it disappeared today. So LIAF certification review class. All right. This one, Diana, videos. Let's see here.
Yes, videos. It should be 1 and 2.
Says the folder's empty.
No.
Yes, it does.
Is Henry here or no?
No, he's not. Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll play the second half of it. It is late anyway. And so I think what you'll see is we will pick up in the second half of the inspection. We'll give that a try, guys. I apologize, but we did actually film the whole thing. It's about 10 minutes. So all you're going to see is about from the halfway point to the end. Okay, but at least you'll get to see what we're talking about here. And then to finish this out on grades and standards, I have some little homework for you guys to do. So let's move on. And oops. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get back into the PowerPoint. You are screen sharing. Okay. Oh, before we get to that, so here's the cue card. This is laminated. You each should get one of these. And it goes through all the steps and little diagrams. All of this is what we've just talked about. Here's the dog leg and the offset and all of that good stuff. And here is the sheet you're going to get and you're going to have on the day of the test. And you just work it through. Show us your work. You know, put the caliper in there. You're going to have a caliper measure. We're going to give you that. You're going to grade the trunk structure, Florida Fancy, number 1, number 2, or call. Crown uniformity, it's either yes or no, fancy or number 2. There's your subtotal in 4. Then there's your major downgrades. Just check them off. And so if you were at number 1 in step 4 and you check off any one of these 5 in step 5, the major downgrades, you're going to be at a number 2. Now, again, you could stop the inspection there or you could require remediation, but we want you to continue on. Even if you're at a 2, we want you to take it all the way through and look at all of these particular parameters. And then the last part, the back page, this is step 7, and you're going to put your final grade right there. Is that, you understand? Okay, we're good?
Are we able to bring our own grades and standards manual with us to the exam?
No, we're going to give you a clipboard like this with your matrices and that grading sheet. And we're going to give you have the cue card and you're going to have the caliper. You're actually going to have some digging tools too.
So you supply the cue card.
Yes, we supply all that. We just want you to show us your homework. Okay? And
Okay, thank you.
grade. Good question. So this is the first part, which is missing. That's okay. It's Occlusia. I grade, we figure out the matrix, which I think was 3. We grade the trunk. We did the caliper. And I think we pick up in, Diana, do you recall, was it step 5? Probably step 5. So here goes. Next is this 5C. The refall is not secure enough to successfully transplant. I like to rock the tree back and forth in the container to see if the tree and the container move as one, as they should. If the tree starts wobbling around and moving, if the container does not, that suggests to me 2 things. Either I have circling root defects, or the tree was just stepped up to the next larger container. Either way, that's not a good thing. So in this case, it all moved as one, so the root ball is secure. 5G, the root baller container is undersized. If 2 or more sizes, reduce the grade by 2. But where do we find out what the minimum container size is for a 2-inch type 3 matrix tree? We go back to our table here, our matrix, and we see for 2 inches we need a 25 gallon, which is what we've got. So we're good on that one. And then last but not least, 5E, the tree with a trunk caliper larger than 2 inches requires a stake to hold the trunk erect. Well, because the tree is 2 inches, we can pass it with the stake on it. But if the tree trunk was wider, larger than 2 inches, we would need to take that stake off to make sure that the tree is not dependent on it. Okay? So we're good there. So no major. I'm not sure what happened there. Next is this 5C. The tree ball is not secure enough to. We've already covered that. All right, I'm gonna pass on that video. I don't know what the problem is, but anyway, we took it all the way through the different steps, and I think we ended up. It was a fancy, or not? It was a number 1. So I went out in the nursery and pulled out a few other trees to grade, and this is kind of the one I want to go through with you guys right now. Great nursery. It's really hard to find a lot of defects in Rob Schultz and getting to the nursery there on Davy Road. But this was a pink tab, and I picked it specifically because it was a bit of a sorry looking tree. Pink tab goes into, with all the tabs go into matrix 3. You guys can hear me okay? Can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Here's this little caliper I was telling you about. So I kind of eyeball what's 6 inches above grade. And as you can see, it's right at about 2 inches. So that's my caliper measurement. And then I move on to grade the trunk of the tree, which I look at the bottom of the tree at the point where, you know, the root flares come out all the way to the tippy top. And essentially it's pretty darn straight. In fact, I might even go so far as to call it a fancy, except for the fact that I'm concerned a little bit that maybe that one limb is not the leader and it looks like it's taller. I honestly can't remember now, but let's call it a number 1, okay? Crown uniformity for a 2-inch caliper matrix 3, we need to have that tree be, let's see here. Well, actually, I'm a little premature. The crown uniformity. This is a case of how uniform is the crown. Is it, you know, is it balanced? It was. It really was. There was no reason why I would downgrade it because of the fact that it was light on one side or heavy on the other. It was consistently sparse, and it's full of holopothrips. But we're not ready to cut it down yet on that particular front. So I guess we gave it a 1 on trunk structure and a Florida fancy on crown uniformity, only because we wanted to pass it on the uniformity. You know, it wasn't really rejectable. So the lowest grade is a number 1. Now we move on to step 5, and what's the minimum height of the tree? Has it been achieved? Okay, so for a 2-inch caliper matrix 3 tree, it needs to be at least 6 feet high. So I put my pole on it and found it was actually 12 feet high. You can eyeball this. You don't need to put a measuring stick on every tree. Then what about the crown diameter? I was a little concerned here that maybe this tree wasn't going to make it, but as it turns out, because it's only a 2-inch trunk, the crown diameter only needs to be 30 inches or greater. And lo and behold, it was 4 feet by 4 feet. Now, good test question. The way you determine the diameter of the crown is you measure the width from here to here, and then you estimate it out in the front all the way to the back. And it's an average of those 2 measurements, okay? Good test question. And so the average came out, well, it was 4 and 4, so 4. If it had been 4 and 2, it would be 3 would be the average. And that would be 36 inches, which still would have met our 30-inch minimum. Is the root ball secure? Yes, we rocked that tree back and forth and everything moved as one. And the container was a 25-gallon again, and that it needed to be a 25, which is what we have. So none of those major downgrades applied. I guess there's one more. 5E, is the training stake still attached to the tree? Yes, it was, but as we agreed, that was not an issue because it was a 2-incher. So moving on to the minor downgrades, our flush cut's evident. We did not see any evidence of that. There are some wounds on the tree trunk, however. What about branch stubs? We did not see those either. Are there open trunk wounds evident? So this one was a little bit concerning, but I decided it was small potatoes and decided not to focus on it. It probably was semi-flush, but it did for the most part close over, and so it's not really open all that much. So I ignored that. And then we get into this question, is 10% of the crown necrotic, chlorotic, or damaged from pest diseases or tipped dieback? And yes, it was. It was the halopothrips had consumed this tree and it was in pretty bad shape. So that is a definite one strike against it, a minor downgrade. So I would take my pencil and my clipboard and I would check off 6D, 10% of crown necrotic, chlorotic, or damaged by pests. And then we get to, is the crown thin and sparsely foliated, allowing for the time of year and recent harvest? This is where I knocked the canopy also. That crown is not acceptable in my opinion. That's not a #1 tree. And so quite honestly, at this point, you could stop the inspection because we were at a 1. Now we've got 2 minor downgrades, 2 minor reductions, which take it down to being a #2. Any questions about that? All right, just for academic purposes, to finish out the process, just like what you're going to be required when we do the test. 6F, is there included bark between a trunk and a major lateral branch or between main trunks? There's a lot of confusion even among arborists as to what an inclusion is, but if you look, and I took my glasses off to see this up close, that codominant limb my finger is on is pointing to actually an inclusion. You see how it's like a valley and it's almost sort of stuck inside the other, inside the leader. So it actually looks to me like there's the codominant situation going there too, but I guess we didn't pick it up when we graded the trunk.
Mike, yes. If you look on the picture on the right, it's more evident.
You know, whoa, wait a minute. Back up, guys. I know what I did here. I'm sorry. This is an example of an inclusion. This was not on the pink tab. This was on the purple tab. I have 3 trees, and we're only going to do 1 tonight because of time. I had a purple tab I pulled out of the tree line too, and that one had the issue of a large codominant limb, way bigger than the leader. Okay, this is the leader, and that was the inclusion. Okay, so I only threw this slide in, has nothing to do with the pink tab we're grading. It was just to show you what an inclusion would look like. That is actually a really good example, and they're not that common. I don't find them too much on trees of this size. So anyway, 6G are major trunks or branches touching. You guys have to bear with me. I already taught a Zoom class this morning for several hours. I'm getting tired. Are trunks or major branches touching? I did not see that on our pink tab. And then the last step is grading the root ball, and I was hard pressed to find any reason to knock it in this particular situation. I did dig away a little bit, and I did find a bit of an anchor root starting. The lighting was kind of dappled. That looks a little funky, but I didn't see any circling roots of any kind either around the trunk or at the periphery of the container. Okay, so, but we already said this was a #2 because of the condition of the canopy. So now I guess I have a few follow-up slides of some other defects that I wanted to point out. And this looked like a flush cut. These are just kind of general photos that I took of some of the other trees in the nursery. And if we did this in person after we graded a couple of trees together, we would just walk down the rows and I would have people try to find defects, just point them out right and left. And so here was a flush cut. It didn't really close over too well. It's an open wound. Here is a wound that's more than 2 inches tall and probably right at about 10% of the diameter, or I'm sorry, the circumference of the tree. That looked to me like a bruise, and it was exuding some sap. This maple, what do you think about this maple? Would this meet the definition of an acceptable canopy uniformity?
I wouldn't. think so.
Probably
Missing the uniformity on the left side.
Yeah, it's got a big void in it, so that would probably be a tree we would want to, and there's not really much of a way to remediate it. You know, you do have to pick your battles with these guys, and if there were some other things that were more important than this, sometimes, you know, you might let this go. It's a very subjective process, I'm telling you. You know, and here's an example. We screwed up one time. We were doing a Publix plaza on down on Sterling Road, and Jimmy Aucamp was the contractor. And when we had reviewed the plans, it called for cypress trees and gumbo limbos. Those were the two main canopy trees in this kind of dry retention area that had a berm around it. And that was where the gumbo limbos were supposed to be. And then the cypress trees were supposed to be down in the pan, right? Okay, it's dry retention. So part of the year it's going to be holding water, part of the year it won't. Well, I'll be honest, we screwed up when we reviewed the plan, and the architect had somehow messed up too. And he had the gumbo limbos down in the pan, and he had the cypress around on the berm, on the high ground. And we went out to do the inspection, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe Jimmy did this. And we got the plan out. You always take your plan with you. And I'm like, Jimmy did this because we approved it. Good God. And I just didn't feel right about accepting that. But I also felt bad because Jimmy was going to have a lot of added expense to have to go in, flip-flop it, which he's a great guy and he wanted to please us. And, you know, he agreed to do it and he did it. So we ended up, the cypress came off the berm down in the pan where they should be, and the gumbos came up. And you're not always going to get a landscape contractor to agree to something like that. Another big screw up is when the plan does not include adjacent property trees that may be shading out the trees on the plan, the install. And I've seen this, like big row of ficus or black olives, and you're planting 3-inch caliper live oak in the shade of those overarching trees. That's stupid. So, you know, again, it's kind of what you can negotiate, what you can kind of get. This maple, interestingly, the leader is back in here, and this limb was taller than the leader. Tree was very vigorous, even though it had a terrible shape. But this would have precluded us from accepting it, number one, even if it had a decent canopy down below, unless this was pruned back. Because remember, for fancies and number ones, you cannot have codominant limbs taller than the leader itself. Okay, maybe this was the leader. It's a little hard for me to remember now.
Mike,
Yes, Diana.
question on that tree, because you say, I know it's no number one or dull for the when it has a big void like that.
Right.
So, and you say your grade is number one, but it should be number two.
It isn't. Okay. And I get what you're saying. What I was reading, aside from this issue, if this was a full canopy and you had this codominant, you had this codominant taller than the leader in the back here, then that would need to be addressed. And that's a simple pruning thing. This is a good wound that closed over nicely. That's what you want to look for. There's some collar here that's still intact, and the wound is beautiful. That you would never want to take off for that. Here's that circling root, and I find them very common on particularly maples and tababuyas, especially purple caps. It's sometimes hard to find trees of some of these lesser common species that are grown properly. But that can be very simply cut and removed. This was an example of, I consider this a growth crack and acceptable. I think what was happening here was the trunk was just expanding in size, and so, you know, there were small little fissures developing. Not really a problem. Somebody needs to mute their mic.
It's Dave.
What happened?
Can you mute your microphone, please? Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so this was the purple tab I was telling you about earlier. So this is the leader, this is the codominant, and this is occurring at below the midpoint. So this tree probably is a cull because it's got multiple codominants, and the midpoint was probably about here. And it had also a nasty girdling root at the base. Look at the size of that. Now again, I need to mention, you can cut these roots if they're at the point where they originate, so long as they're not greater than 1/3 the trunk diameter. And I didn't mention that earlier, but this root, in my opinion, is too large to cut. It has to be at least 1/10 the diameter of the trunk to be an offensive defect. But if it's greater than 1/3 of the trunk diameter, you're not allowed to cut it. And looking at it, it looks like this root is putting enough pressure, it's beginning to crack the trunk. You see that? See that there? So this is already doing some wounding. So this tree would be considered a cull.
So if that root was coming out perpendicular to the trunk, it would be okay?
Yes, let's say it was this
Instead of-
root, and it was growing out this way, that would be totally acceptable. And even if it meandered and followed the trunk for a little bit, it's got to be 1/3, which is about what this is. You see that? And then looks like there's another one down here, and then this is going to be interfering with that. And you know, I'm not saying you couldn't cut this here and take it back to the nursery and try to redeploy it, but it's just not acceptable for a job site. And here's that other inclusion that I had on the pink tab. So again, bark inclusion. And then I think this is the last one. This is on the maple. We've got a stem girdling root here that is about 1/10. That would be a defect. This one probably is too small. Would I cut it if it was my backyard? Absolutely, because I know it's only going to get bigger. But this one would probably be large enough to be considered a downgrading factor. So that's that. I have a few more things I want to cover with you. There's some items on the test that we didn't get to today. But before I do, does anybody have any questions?
Nope.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on. It is, we got about 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to have to say adios because I'm sure you guys are more than ready to go. Let's see here. I'm going to need to stop sharing. And I'm going to need to go back to my PowerPoint. And okay, here we go. Except I need to share this again. You guys can't see this, can you?
Not yet.
No, we're looking at you.
Okay. All right, so I need to screen share. And then I need to go into, bear with me here. It was here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So grading and remediation. I just want to go over a few more terms. The branch collar, what that looks like. You can all see this now, right?
Yes.
I can see it.
Okay, so this is an example of a branch collar on a mature landscape tree. And here's a branch bark ridge. This is a stub, so we were going to make the cut. We'd make the cut there, leaving this collar, branch collar on the tree, just so you're aware of what that is. Now, it'd be much smaller on a nursery tree. It's just installed, but just so you understand about the swelling and the fact that trunk tissue is wrapping around this branch, which is why it's such a good secure connection. Okay. Here's a cut I made on a gumbo limbo at Markham Park a few weeks back. You can see the collar is still intact, the swelling, that's a good cut. That's going to close over. A flush cut would be made here and would be a much larger diameter wound that exposes trunk wood. So we don't want to have flush cuts. The reduction cut, when you want to shorten that codominant that's making that tree a number 2, because this codominant is occurring below the midpoint, you want to make it into a number 1, you make a reduction cut. You cut the larger limb, the upright codominant, back significantly to the point where it no longer threatens the leader's superiority. You cut it back to another lower, smaller lateral limb. This is basic tree trimmer 1. And that's totally acceptable. If you want to make that contractor make that cut instead of remove and replace the tree, go for it. I did it all the time. A lot of times they didn't know how to do this and I'd have to demonstrate for them, but be careful you don't end up doing their work. So here's an example on a tree that would be relatively close to an install situation. We had a grades and standards conference in 2006 where people from Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward came together, growers, inspectors. There had been some real tension between the two groups over inspectors are getting too picky and growers aren't taking into account the new grades and standards and they need to do more, and there was a lot of back and forth. So it was agreed to have this big summit and they brought in all kinds of trees with good ones and bad ones, and we talked about the defects and we made corrections. And then at the end of the day, I had all these trees on the IFAS property. It's like, what were we going to do with them? Because especially the ones that weren't very good, they didn't even want to take them back to the nursery. Some did, some didn't, but we ended up planting a lot of trees, and this was one of them. This was a mahogany that had a codominancy, 2 equally sized trunks meeting at about the midpoint. So this would have been on the fence between a number 1 and a number 2. And so I came in and I made a reduction cut right here and got rid of all of this, which was competing with my leader. I chose this to be my leader because it had a nice set of good scaffold branches developing. And here it is now with my reduction cut. There's a close-up of the cut. And I could walk away and not, sign off on this as a number 1 tree. No problem whatsoever. Okay. What do you see that's wrong with the staking on this tree?
It's too tight. It's going to girdle.
It's too tight. I think I probably have to admit to that. That was a few years ago. Those trees are still, that tree's still there and it's done very well. Very sandy soil. So, and about cutting the roots, this is what can happen if you don't get those stem girdling roots, at installation time. You don't take care of them, they will grow and become embedded, and they'll actually begin to crush the phloem that conducts the sugars down to the root system. It creates like a roadblock. They become embedded and you have a hell of a time getting them out. What we try to do is try to get in there with like a Sawzall and get as much of it out. We were just kind of playing around with this one. It was so embedded. We got some, but not all of it out. I don't know what ended up happening, but this one had a big root laying right in here, and we got that out, and that tree went on to have a much better life. So I have some pictures of some trees that Diana, you may recognize a few of these. I took these a few years back out at our IFAS nursery. But what would you grade this fern tree as? But just looking at it.
Number 1.
It's a 1.
Nope. What's the major defect?
Oh, I know. Codominant.
Yes. It's got a codominant limb in the lower half. This is about the midpoint. You can't, maybe you can see, maybe you can't, but if it had been up here, it probably would have been a number 1, but it's actually right below the midpoint. This one's tied kind of tight too, isn't it?
Could you remediate that?
Yes, absolutely. You just subordinate it. I probably cut this limb off right here, leave this little bit, and go ahead and pass it. That's strong subordination. You want to walk away having signed off knowing that this is no longer going to threaten the leader.
So if you fix that codominance, will you pass it as number 1 or Florida Fancy? Because other than that, I don't see any problem with it.
Good question. I don't know. I'd have to kind of look at it and think about it. The canopy is certainly going to be acceptable in terms of Yeah, it could end up, it's a little sparse looking to me, and I might want to look at that a little bit, with the minor downgrades, but it's possible, Diana, if you were able to take care of that.
Mike,
Probably come in as a number one.
Mike, does it really matter if it's a Florida fancy or a number one?
Well,
As long as it's a number
only
one or
if-
better, right?
You are inspecting against the landscape plan that was approved. So if it's at a number one, it certainly does not need to be a fancy.
Right. But what landscape plan says all material must be Florida fancy? I've never seen one.
Super high-end properties, with somebody
Yeah.
that knows a lot. I don't know, maybe some hotel.
Okay.
It's rare. I don't know that maybe once I ever came across one of those.
Yeah, I never have. I was just asking you
Yeah.
what if it matters if it's a number one or a Florida fancy, as long as it's a number one or better, right?
Yeah, no, that's it. If it's a number one, it's
Okay.
good.
As an estimator, I see it all day long lately. I don't know if it's just new architects or maybe not local architects. I don't know if they just think saying Florida fancy thinks they're going to get them a nicer tree, but I have to laugh at how many. I even see it on shrubs. I see it a lot more. But I see plans. I see 10 sets of plans a day. So
I have to tell you, it's a great comment. I have to tell you that I think a lot of these architects probably don't even understand the grades and standards. You'd be surprised how few people really have done what you guys have done tonight and are willing to go through this process. And again, if you practice it, it becomes second nature. And I never took a measuring stick out on a job site. I was able to estimate it. But looking at this little live oak here, I guess, and I put these notes in here some time ago. It was supposed to be, because of the trunk size in a 45 gallon, and it did not have the canopy width to be able to justify it as a number one. So there's no remediation there. It's just kind of a weak, sparse tree, and it's got too small of a canopy, so that would go back to the nursery. What about this calophyllum? What defects do you see here?
The crown.
The crown is what?
So
Sparse, especially at the top. And
really thin, and
Yeah.
it doesn't have enough foliage.
Yeah, it's got a terrible shape to the canopy, so that's a downgrade. There, it's got dieback in it. It's even got a
got
codominant.
the shoots on the trunk going down.
It's got a lot of sprouting going on, which is typical. When you get dieback up top, usually you get sprouting down below. Yeah, this would probably be a call. Here's a trunk wound that exceeds the allowable size. Now you could argue, some people might think that that's closed over, but that tree is stressed. I can just tell by looking at the pattern of the trunk wood. It's probably been in a container a long time. And we do see these trees from time to time, but that was definitely longer than 2 inches, and it's probably at about 1/10 the diameter of the circumference. How about this one? What would you grade this one as? It's a mahogany.
I think that's a cold too, because you see the root, this one is like more than 1/3 of the.
Yeah, it's got some circling root issues, and this root right here,
It appears it's got 2 circling roots.
it's got one here. This one's
yeah,
diving over, and I didn't bring that up. Plunging roots that come out to the edge of the container and then they dive, are not considered a downgrade according to grading standards. Now, Dr. Gilman taught us in root that circles or
I
dives.
understand. What do you want me to say?
Any root that circles or dives does not anchor the tree. It acts like a hinge. But the Grades and Standards Committee, I brought this up to them too. I said, we need to get serious about these plunging roots, because they should be cut at installation if they're not cut, in the nursery. And why don't you consider a plunging root just like a circling root? And I got the comment back was there was not enough research at this point in time to make that a big enough issue, which I don't actually agree with, but committee rules. So
Mike, you're saying a plunging root wouldn't decline the tree?
No, I'm saying a plunging root, like a circling root, acts like a hinge, and it does not adequately anchor the tree. Now, if you plant that tree and that plunging root eventually branches out, You know, it's about roots need to radiate out to anchor the trees in the ground. And so, like I said, Dr. Gilman taught if the root circles or it dives, it won't anchor the tree. But what I'm telling you is the grades and standards, although it goes after the circling roots, they have not agreed to go after plunging roots.
Because I found that different in Coconut Creek when the tree grows, the root goes horizontal, hits the side of the bucket, plunges down. That tree's failed. You need to snip the root on site, or you need to remove the tree.
Well,
Not true.
Sharon can make that
Sharon,
requirement.
oh, I
Sharon
don't
can
want
make
to
that
say
requirement if she wants. That is up to her, but it should be on the plan. It should be on the landscape plan, and if it's not, you can contest that.
It's not.
You
Okay.
know,
All right.
She is going beyond the grades and standards, and I mean, you could require, if you wanted a $5 bill pinned to every major branch on the tree if you wanted, if you could get that accepted in the plan. But what I'm telling you is Grades and Standards Committee has not been willing to go after plunging roots.
Okay. All right. No, I took my Falcos and snipped it, and she was happy. So that was it. But,
I
okay.
know,
That's
I
news.
know you know, and she knows that that tree will have a better outcome because you did that. And Dr.
Oh,
you
sure.
did that, you did
Sure,
that
it
with
will.
the pink tab. And Dr. Gilman had me go back and unearth that cut time and time again. I took pictures, and we cut it in July of 2008 when the tree was planted. It was a face-to-face program. We didn't have the distance in those days. And I come back about after 3 months in, you know, summertime growth, and that tree, that wound developed callus tissue like a pruning wound on the trunk, and lots of roots coming out going horizontal. It was a beautiful thing. And then he made me come back another 6 months and dig it out and take another picture. And it worked beautiful. And so it should be required, but what I'm telling you is it's not.
Yeah, I was agreeing with you. It should be required, and I was kind of surprised to hear you telling me that it's not, because yeah, it absolutely should be. Okay.
Well, and I'll be brutally honest, there are some big growers on that committee. You know, committee rules, you know, I mean, somebody's got to make up the rules, and a lot of times it's who's at the table.
I hear you.
So,
There is a point, Mike, that, you know, when you got the anchoring roots, actually some of those will extend to conform the structured root plate. If you have one plunging root, then basically you're not compromising the stability of the tree.
you know, Jorge,
It is debatable. I mean, to some extent.
it's very possible that that plunging root could develop a lateral root, which could eventually anchor the tree. I totally get it. And, you know, the jury is still out on how many years that might take for that that plunging root to develop enough horizontal root structure to adequately anchor it. But we all know that if that plunging root did not occur as a plunging root early on, the tree would be better off. So yeah, there's some give and take here. And, you know, like I said, I tried to get myself on the committee, but they wouldn't put me on. They offered me a position on the palm committee. And I told them, I said, you know what? I don't agree with your grades and standards for palms. I really don't. I said, you know, it's way too complicated. You got to count the number of fronds and relative to the trunk diameter. And it's like, don't put me on the palm committee. I believe I belong on the hardwood committee or not at all. They did take my feedback. They did consider it. And so, you know, that was it. I just want to go over just a couple more things. I don't have any more slides, but I want to make sure I've covered all the test material. And so water, how much water a new tree needs. We talked about 3 to 4 months per inch of caliper for establishment. It's about 2 gallons per day per inch of caliper. So if it's a 3-inch caliper live oak, I use that all the time, you need to put about 6 gallons of water down every time you water it. And there are all kinds of watering schedules out there. Most of them, the first couple of weeks, they want daily watering, and then they begin to back it off after that to 3, maybe 3 times a week. But it is 2 gallons per inch of trunk caliper. So 6 gallons for a 3-inch caliper tree. And establishment, that period means that that tree is not still able to completely fend for itself and needs an irrigation backup system until establishment occurs. And so for 3-inch, it would be about 9 to 12 months. Okay. We talked about the branch collar, you know all about that. Temporary branches on young shade trees should not be limbed off, but should be shortened and kept small because, because why? They contribute to the girth and strength of the trunk. And if you limb them up too early, you're gonna have a weak tree. But if you don't limb them up and you let them get big and fat and happy at 3 and 4 feet, I've seen it, you're going to make 2 and 3 inch diameter cuts on the trunk. That's not a good thing. How far out does the root system extend on a typical canopy tree?
Along with the canopy?
Or more than.
Beyond the canopy, yes, beyond the canopy. And that's the issue we get into with the cities and sidewalk replacements. You know, you've got a 30-year-old mahogany with a 2-foot diameter trunk in a 6-foot wide swale. And the recommendation is don't cut within 5 times the trunk diameter. Well, 2 feet times 5 is what, 10 feet? That just doesn't even exist. You don't have 10 feet out from the trunk. You have a sidewalk that's probably 2 feet out from the trunk, if that. So, yeah, when we're replacing sidewalks and cutting major anchor roots, we are doing these trees a disservice, and probably we'll see some dieback up top. I've seen it. We'll probably see some blowovers. So when it comes to removing sidewalks and replacing them to avoid litigation and lawsuits, I say right tree, right place. And if you have to cut roots, only cut them in the poor zone. Don't cut the roots all the way down. And people want to do that. And I think you're just asking for real trouble.
You wanna come down to Coral Gables?
I just was on the phone with a community in Pembroke Pines today that has got horrendous issues. My own HOA does too. You're going to put large canopy trees in. You got to have a large plantable space, at least 10 feet wide. And you know, that was one thing I noticed when I went out and did these tree removal permit requests, almost without exception, infrastructure damage was occurring when trees were closer than 5 feet. You know, somebody's driveway's cracked and there's a tree 3 feet away. The roots are going to my pool. I want the tree out. Well, you know, who planted it 6 feet away from the pool? You know, so we don't think about mature rooting space. And when you review plans, you got to think about this tree is going to get 40 feet in diameter someday. I need a hell of a lot of space in order to accommodate this tree. So this species is not going to work here. Water sprouts and suckers originate from what's called epicormic shoots that are typically found on older wood. That's why when we get over crazy with our pruning, or sometimes we have bad storm damage and large limbs are broken or need to be clean cut, we get a lot of sprouting. That sprouting comes from dormant. We call those epicormic buds, and they're more common on older wood than younger wood, okay? Oh, the roots of trees in Florida grow primarily in the top 1 to 2 feet. This is not like New York, where some of us came from, myself included, or the Midwest, where tap roots go down 5, 6 feet. In Florida, because of the shallow water table and the kind of rock we've got, the limestone rock that underlies the area, these roots tend to be pretty flat. You've all seen the ficus trees that go over in the storms, and God, the root systems look like a pancake. So the top 1 to 2 feet, and that's where the majority of the roots are, probably even the top 10 inches. Let's see, we talked about the mulch. Oh, we didn't talk about the grow bags and the containers. So containers and grow bags, the woven fabric, all that shit comes off the root ball before the tree goes in the ground. The plastic wrap too. I had a neighbor who butchered his oak tree. It was so sad to see it. I actually had to call it in. I couldn't stand to watch it every weekend. He'd hack away at more and more of it till there was almost nothing left. And so I reported it, and because we just can't have that going on. I mean, if you didn't like the oak tree, put in a request for a removal permit and replace the damn thing with something more reasonable for your yard. I get it. So he puts in a magnolia, claimed he spent $900. The tree died. The tree died about 6 months, maybe not even, after it was installed by the lawn guy. The lawn guy did it. And I never admitted to him that I called it in, but I went and I said, I knocked on his door and I says, I see your new tree died. I said, that's too bad. What happened? He says, yeah, I'm really mad. That sucker cost me $900. I said, who put that in for you? He says, my lawn guy. I said, oh, do you think maybe there's a problem with the roots? He says, I don't know. It got inspected by the city and they passed it. I'm like, oh my God. This tree had shrink wrap on the root ball. It was engulfed in plastic and planted that way.
My God.
Crazy, crazy stuff. So he had to put another magnolia in. He got a different guy. And that tree didn't do well because magnolias aren't well suited in South Florida. We all know that. Anyway, the baskets, the wire baskets, the wire should stay on the root ball. If you take the wire off, the root ball may fall apart. But the wire that's at the top can be a hazard in the aftermath. And so we like to cut the wire basket back so none of it's exposed. Just cut the top off. If there's burlap, as there typically is, you don't leave that exposed also. You cut the burlap off at least up to the top so it's not exposed. You leave the burlap on the majority of the root ball, it's gonna rot. But you don't leave it covered and exposed because it can dry out like wicking, wick the moisture away from the root ball. And I see trees get installed with the nylon rope still tied around the trunk. I see all this kind of stuff. Anything that's visible needs to go away, okay? I think that's about it. Unless you guys have any questions, I've tried to cover most of what is on the exam. You know, we don't necessarily guarantee we cover each and every question, but you don't have to get each and every question right. We've covered a ton of material tonight, and I know I've kept you a lot longer than the other ones did. It's 9:15, but are there any questions before we say goodnight?
Yes.
Fire away.
So how much you have to prune a tree in 1 year?
Well, that's a very subjective thing. I mean, it depends. And there is a test question, I just remembered it, that after you plant a tree, or even if, well, maybe a little less so when you transplant it from one site to another, but the old recommendation was to cut it back, cut the foliage back when you plant the new tree, because the thinking was some of the roots will be damaged and it will not be sufficient to compensate for the canopy up top. That's not true. Research showed that the presence of a full canopy helped regenerate roots. And so when you're planting a tree, and one exception would be, let's say you're gonna dig a tree up and move it, and you know you're losing roots, especially if it's the summertime, you might wanna cut some of it back just to reduce that transpirational load. But the research says it's better not to, because you need that green foliage to help generate the sugars to grow the root system. And that's what the tree is going to first start trying to grow roots before it's going to grow shoots. So Diana, to answer your question, it all depends on the needs of the tree and the condition of the tree and what you're trying to achieve. Oh, one other thing, root pruning in advance of moving a tree. You don't want to cut all the roots at once. You want to typically split, maybe do half of them and give yourself a good 3 to 4 month lead time, which almost never happens because people think about the trees as an afterthought. I get this all the time. Yeah, well, the county wants to save these trees. They're doing an airport expansion or they're going to build a new parking garage. And we've got, 30-year-old gumbo limbos that are crazy big and we want to move those trees. It's like, oh my God. And we want to root prune them. And when you want to break ground in 3 weeks, it's not going to happen. You need a good 3 to 4 week period, and you need to keep those cut roots moist. The idea is you cut half the roots, let them regenerate a little. And when you cut the other roots and move the tree, you've got at least half the root ball ready to go, roots that are already regenerating. But if you cut them roots and you don't water that tree, especially if you're doing it in the dry season, you're not going to get much regeneration. So they need to go on an irrigation system. Any other questions?
Yeah. Why does Kevin have such a nice background like he's in Colorado and you're in the office?
If you're if you're savvy enough to know how to do that, and I have done it, but I don't really like any of my backgrounds, and I usually don't bother with it. You can see my messy office this way, but yeah, you can do all. It's a little a couple buttons you got to click. I just not sure what they are.
It's a setting. It's just the virtual background.
There he is. There he
Yeah.
is.
I don't know why I'm
Looking
Jose
good.
Lopez, by the way. I don't know what happened here. Like I don't know if my I don't know why my Zoom name is Jose Lopez all of a sudden, because I didn't change it, so I don't know what happened there. But no, it's pretty easy. It's a cool, easy setting.
I've done it. It's this way you guys know I'm still at the office.
Slaving away, Mike. We know.
Kevin,
It's been a long day.
I hope you
It's been a long
enjoyed
day.
your 2-hour nap. Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it.
Are you kidding me? That was riveting. I learned something new every time I watch this.
I think after this class, we could all become certified arborists. It was the same course.
This might
Thanks,
be a
guys. I
little
appreciate
different
it.
thing, but thanks everybody. I sent you a note. I'm going to try to get the videos all up this weekend. We've got 4 of them now with Mike's completion here, and we'll try to get you some more information this week on the location of the exam. It's not going to be held at the UF campus for those who came in late, so we'll get you that information this week. And Mike, you were about to say something?
I want to send them the tree grading sheet so they can familiarize themselves, and the day they show up for their test, it doesn't look Greek to them.
If you want to send that to me, Mike, I can forward it on to everybody.
Yeah, we'll send that out to everybody, and even I can probably do a PDF on some of the PowerPoints.
Great. I'm sure that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right, guys. Well, I appreciate your taking your time and spending your evening with me, and I hope it was helpful. Time to go home. Kick back.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks
very
everybody
much.
for your
I'll
time
take
this
care.
evening. We'll see you
Bye.
next week.
Thank you, sir,
Okay.
and have a good night. Be safe.
Yes. Adios.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Mike.
Bye, Diana. Sweet dreams.